In 1974, 18-year-old Sabrina Cain lived in Belleville, Illinois with her mother, Laureen, and her stepfather, Fred Rourke, an officer with the Belleville Police Department. After graduating from Belleville West High School in 1973, Sabrina began working full-time at Midwest Savings and Loan and part-time at a Kmart grocery in the evenings. In the beginning of December 1973, Sabrina's demeanor became very anxious, according to her boyfriend at the time, Bob Deller, who worked with Sabrina at the Kmart. She would not tell him what was wrong, but her mood seemed to improve by Christmas. Her improved spirits did not last, however, and by February of 1974, she was distraught enough about her home life that she wanted to move out of her mother and stepfather's house. On the afternoon of February 3rd, Sabrina asked Bob to drive her to the home of one of her friends in O'Fallon, Illinois. She told him that she wanted to leave home because of her stepfather's behavior. After she arrived, she called her mother. Laureen Rourke promised Sabrina she would help her find an apartment and move into it if she came home. Sabrina agreed to come home. Laureen advised her to call her friend, Patty Linton, to ask for a ride, because her stepfather would be angry if Bob brought her home. Fred Rourke did not allow his adult stepdaughter to date. Sabrina called Patty, who agreed to give her a ride home. Bob and Sabrina drove to a park, where they met Patty and her husband Kurt, who then drove Sabrina back to her house. When Bob saw Sabrina at the Kmart the following day, she was even more set in her resolve to leave home. She told Bob that she was going to wait until her stepfather was not home, and then move all of her clothes out of the house. Bob offered to let her borrow his car to do so, but she declined his offer. Bob saw Sabrina again around 10:30 in the morning on February 5th, again at the Kmart, when she came in specifically to speak with him. She was now getting even more support from Patty and Kurt Linton. After Patty got off work that day, she was going to look at apartments with Sabrina, and Sabrina would be spending the night at her apartment, rather than go back to the house she was so determined to leave. Sabrina told Bob that she would call him around 6 o'clock that evening. She never did. Sabrina had been driven to the Kmart to see Bob by Kurt Linton. He had picked her up at a shopping center a mile from her home after she called him for a ride. She had walked over to see Patty at her job at the Bank of Belleville at 9:30 that morning to ask if she could stay at her apartment while she looked for one of her own. Patty agreed after reminding Sabrina that she would have to sleep on the floor. This did not bother Sabrina, who just wanted to be out of her mother and stepfather's house. Sabrina then left to go to the shopping center across the street from the bank to call Kurt, because she could not use the bank's phone. Sabrina was inside the Kmart speaking with Bob for 20 to 30 minutes, while Kurt waited for her outside. After she came out of the store, Kurt drove her back to the apartment he and Patty shared. At the Lintons' apartment, Sabrina made several phone calls. Most of them were to inquire about apartments for rent, and one was to her mother, who was at work. Sabrina told Kurt that her mother had agreed to help her move her clothes over to the Lintons' apartment after her shift was over that afternoon. Patty arrived at the apartment on her lunch break around 11:40. She made them all lunch and then left to go back to work after they ate. Sabrina offered to do the dishes, and Kurt began looking at his phonograph. He decided that it needed a new needle and told Sabrina he was going to make a quick trip to the store to buy one. Between 12:30 and 12:35, Kurt was leaving the shopping center, having purchased the needle, waiting to turn left onto bypass Route 50. While he was waiting for a break in the traffic, he saw Sabrina's blue Plymouth Satellite with a floral top drive by, heading west on bypass Route 50. When the car drove past him, he saw Sabrina sitting in its passenger seat, her long blonde hair blowing in the wind. The initial statement Kurt would make to police states that he saw Sabrina's stepfather, Fred Rourke, driving the car. However, in a subsequent interview, he would clarify that this had been a misunderstanding, and that he had not been able to see who had been driving the car. Kurt had left his key to his apartment with Sabrina, so he was unable to return home. He instead went straight to his job at the Kresge store. He was able to later provide police with such a specific window of time when he had seen Sabrina drive past him, because the exact time he made it to work, shortly thereafter, was recorded on his time card. When Patty Linton returned to work after her lunch break, she was told that Fred Rourke had called asking to speak with her several times while she was gone. Not wanting to continue receiving such calls at her place of employment, she called him back. He asked her what the trouble with Sabrina was. She told him that she was not sure, but that Sabrina was determined to move out on her own. Patty also told him that Sabrina was at her apartment, if he wanted to go talk to her. Fred Rourke would later say that he had gone over to the Lintons' apartment to speak with his stepdaughter. Sabrina let him inside the apartment and then agreed to go home to speak with him. She left Patty a note, and then she and her stepfather left to drive home. When they arrived, Fred sat down on the couch, and Sabrina sat down on the arm of a chair near the front door, leaving her coat on. He asked her what was wrong, and instead of responding, Sabrina got up and walked out of the house. Rourke did not go after her. When Sabrina's mother, Laureen, returned home from work that afternoon, Fred was there, but Sabrina was not. Fred told her Sabrina had been angry and walked out of the house. Laureen Rourke then went out looking for her daughter, but Fred did not go with her to help. Patty Linton arrived home from work at 3:45 and found the note from Sabrina explaining that she had gone home with Fred and saying that she would call her later. Patty later tried calling Sabrina at home and was told by Laureen that Sabrina had stormed out of the house earlier that afternoon. Kurt Linton returned from work at 6 o'clock that evening, and the couple remained at home waiting for a call from Sabrina that never came. Fred Rourke claimed that Sabrina had walked out of his house sometime between 1 and 1:30 in the afternoon on February 5, 1974. She never returned home, and there were no later sightings of her. Despite this, her mother and stepfather did not report her missing until March 22nd, more than 6 weeks after she disappeared. Fred claimed that he had not reported Sabrina missing any earlier because she had run away from home before, but had always come home eventually. While Sabrina had been trying to leave home in the days before her disappearance, she had remained in almost constant contact with her mother and friends about her whereabouts. She had specific plans to prepare to move out on her own. She left home without any of her clothes, which were very important to her, or any money. The day before she went missing, she told a coworker that she only had $3, as she had recently given her mother $50. Furthermore, it was highly out of character for Fred Rourke to let Sabrina's whereabouts be unknown for 6 hours, much less 6 weeks. According to Sabrina's friends and coworkers, her relationship with her stepfather was highly unusual. She would fail to show up to planned activities because she had to spend time with him. He tried to control who she was friends with, and he forbade her from dating. When she had been in high school, he would often come pick her up after school to ensure that she was not spending time with boys or friends he did not approve of after classes ended for the day. Sabrina graduated high school in 1973, but Fred would not allow her any new freedoms, and his behavior remained just as controlling as ever. He seemed to be hyper-focused on Sabrina and her whereabouts. He held the use of her car over her head to try to influence her behavior. Sabrina had been without access to the car and reliant on others for rides just before she vanished because she had gotten so frustrated with this behavior that she had thrown the car's keys at Fred following an argument. She would rather be without a car rather than let her stepfather continue using her access to one in this way. Sabrina had confided in a few people about instances where her stepfather would strike her or push her down. He had once thrown her against a wall and then used his hands to rub makeup off of her eyes because he did not like her wearing it. She told a coworker at Midwest Savings and Loan that her mother had once tried to intervene on her behalf, but Fred had then struck her as well. When Sabrina had started her job at Midwest Savings and Loan in October of 1973, her coworkers viewed her as outgoing and personable. The stress she was under at home seemed to weigh heavily on her, however. Her coworkers, like her boyfriend, had noted that Sabrina had been especially anxious in December of 1973. Sabrina had also come into work on at least one occasion in tears over her stepfather's behavior. On April 20th, 1974, 2 men were target shooting in Stookie Township, west of Belleville. In Forney Lake, off of Town Hall Road, they observed what appeared to be a body floating in the water, some 30 feet from the shore. They went to the home of a sheriff's deputy who lived nearby to report what they had observed. The civil defense was called in to use a boat to extract the body from the water and bring it to shore. The assistant coroner had been called to the scene, and he identified the body badly decomposed from its time in the water, as that of a white female. His preliminary examination showed bullet wounds to the back of her head, her shoulder, and her back. The woman's hands had been bound behind her back, and a concrete block had been tied to her waist, presumably to weigh her body down. She was wearing 4 rings, one of which was a Belleville West class ring bearing the initials SJC. The Belleville Police Department notified the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office that they had a missing persons report filed on someone who matched the description of the woman found in the lake, Sabrina Jean Cain. They were also advised that her stepfather was an officer with the department. Fred Rourke was then brought in and asked to identify the rings the young woman had been found wearing. He positively identified the class ring as belonging to Sabrina and made a tentative identification of the other 3 rings. Rourke was very upset during this initial interaction at the sheriff's department, and after describing the last time he had seen Sabrina, he asked to see the clothing found on the body so that he could be positive that it was Sabrina. He was therefore brought to the Gardner Funeral Home, where the body had been taken. He was able to confirm that the clothes found with the body belonged to Sabrina. The items of clothing matched the descriptions given of the clothes Sabrina had been wearing on the day she disappeared, provided by the people who had seen her that day. Rourke was also able to identify Sabrina's underwear, and noted that she had purchased that pair not long before she went missing. While he was advised against it, Rourke also asked to see Sabrina's body. He was unable to make an identification due to its condition. The area near the pond where Sabrina's body had been found was heavily wooded, and authorities had used a local radio station to appeal for volunteers to help search it. After meeting with the sheriff's department and going to the funeral home, Fred Rourke showed up as one of those volunteers. He arrived at the scene at approximately 6:45 p.m. with one of his neighbors, Jack Erlinger. Rourke asked the deputies at the scene if anyone had searched the trestle on the road half a mile west of the lake for Sabrina's purse. When he was told no, he and Jack went to do so. When they returned, they said that they did not find anything. Jack Erlinger would later say that Rourke was never out of his sight during their search. Sabrina's father, Cain, lived in Arcola, Illinois, approximately 150 miles northeast of Belleville. He had remarried after his divorce from Laureen and lived with his wife and their daughter, Sabrina's 7-year-old half-sister, Kimberly. Laureen and Fred Rourke did not notify him when Sabrina went missing. Cork and his wife heard on the news that the body of a young woman with long blonde hair had been found in a pond while they were spending the weekend in St. Louis. They did not learn until the following day, when a family member called them, that the body had been Sabrina's. Cork had been left unaware that anything had happened to his daughter during the 2.5 months she was missing, and never notified of her death by her mother or stepfather, and was left to hear of it indirectly. Fred Rourke claimed that he had looked for Sabrina after she went missing, and some of Sabrina's friends did report that Fred had asked them about Sabrina's whereabouts after she disappeared. However, despite being a police officer, Rourke apparently did not believe that checking with Sabrina's father, or anyone on his side of her family, would be beneficial to his investigation into her whereabouts. In his initial interview with police after he identified Sabrina's rings and learned that her body had been found, Rourke had told police that he had even traveled to Sabrina's hometown of Tuscola, Illinois, trying to find her. Arcola, where Cain lived, is just south of Tuscola, but Rourke did not stop there to see if Sabrina had been in contact with him. Cork and Kimberly Cain were able to attend Sabrina's funeral, but were excluded from her obituary. During the course of their investigation, authorities continued to hear stories of Fred Rourke's allegedly abusive and controlling behavior towards Sabrina from her friends and co-workers. These accounts focused investigators' attention on Rourke. During an interview at the sheriff's department the day after Sabrina's body was discovered, Rourke claimed that he had nothing to hide. He consented to a search of his home and boat, and to the examination of his personal firearm, which fired the same caliber of bullets found in Sabrina's body during her autopsy. 3 officers from the sheriff's department therefore went to the Rourke residence after the interview was completed. Rourke's boat was searched to see if he used the same kind of tow rope used to tie the concrete block to Sabrina's body, but none was found. When asked to produce his firearm, a .380 automatic, Rourke told the officers that it was on a chest of drawers in his bedroom. When he went to retrieve it, however, it was not there. He and Lorene looked for it throughout the house, but could not find it. Rourke then suggested to the officers that he may have left the firearm at a home he had been renovating, approximately 2.5 miles away from his residence. Fred Rourke, the officers, and Lorene Rourke then drove to that house. Rourke unlocked the door and let them all inside. He then went straight to a closet, glanced inside, and told the officers that the gun was not inside of it. One of the officers noted in his report that it was too dark inside the unlit closet for anyone to be able to actually see anything inside of it. The rest of the house was searched for the weapon without success. Rourke then suggested that the gun must have been stolen at some point. If a thief had gotten inside of the locked home, the gun was the only item they took, and they left behind a gold watch and numerous hand and power tools being used in the renovation of the house. The officers informed Rourke that several people, including a sergeant with the Belleville Police Department, had seen him with the weapon recently. Rourke then told them that he may have had the weapon with him when he had searched the area around the lake where Sabrina's body had been found the day before. He and the officers therefore went back to Forney Lake, where he showed them the exact areas he and Jack Erlinger had searched and looked for the gun. He could not locate it. Rourke assured the officers that he would turn over the weapon, should he ever find it. Without the actual gun, the sheriff's department then tried to locate slugs fired from the weapon to compare to the ones taken from Sabrina's body. On April 23rd, officers went to a farm owned by Fred Rourke's father, John Rourke. Fred Rourke had mentioned that he had used the .380 automatic for target practice on his father's property. John Rourke confirmed that both he and his son had fired the weapon and showed them where on the property they had done so. The officers began sifting and digging through the soil. They initially only found .22 caliber slugs and .38 caliber reloads. Eventually, they did find what they believed could be a .380 slug. However, when it was taken to the St. Louis Police Department laboratory, they learned that it was actually a 9mm slug. The FBI examined the bullets and bullet fragments found in Sabrina's body, as well as the 9mm bullet found at John Rourke's farm at the end of 1974. They listed the model of Fred Rourke's gun as one of several that left rifling impressions consistent with those found on the bullets from Sabrina's autopsy, but obviously could not say if it was the specific weapon used, as they had no bullet fired from it for comparison. Rourke's weapon was never located, and therefore never tied to the crime. At the beginning of his interview on April 21st, Rourke had been asked to undergo a polygraph examination. He said no. Later in the interview, and at the end of it, however, he said he would be willing to submit to a polygraph. When it came time to actually schedule the examination, however, he reverted back to his original position and refused to come in for it. On April 25, 1974, Michael Mercurio, the acting chief of police of the Belleville Police Department, ordered Rourke to submit to the polygraph and advised him that he would be fired from the department if he failed to do so. Rourke filed for an injunction challenging the order, with the court ruling in his favor. In his decision, St. Clair County Circuit Judge Joseph Cunningham ruled that the order violated Rourke's constitutional rights against self-incrimination. When a second order to appear for a polygraph was issued, however, the same judge upheld it, now stating that by halting the order, the court would be injecting itself into the administration of the city. Rourke did eventually appear for the polygraph on May 22nd, but refused to answer any questions beyond providing his name, occupation, and address. In a letter addressed to the Belleville Board of Fire and Police Commissioners, Acting Chief Mercurio wrote that, to all other questions presented to him, he refused to answer on the grounds that it might tend to incriminate him. Rourke had initially been suspended with pay while Sabrina's case was being investigated. After his refusal to cooperate at his polygraph, he was suspended without pay from the police force at the end of May of 1974. He was fired the following month for conduct unbecoming of an officer and disobeying a direct order. His dismissal was the result of a unanimous decision by the Belleville Board of Fire and Police Commissioners. Rourke went back to court to challenge his dismissal from the police force, but the circuit court upheld it in January of 1975. A coroner's inquest into Sabrina's death was held in the beginning of May 1974. Both Fred and Lorraine Rourke refused to testify during the proceedings, both invoking the Fifth Amendment. Lorraine had testified during a St. Clair County Circuit Court grand jury 2 days prior. The inquest ruled that Sabrina's death was a homicide committed by an unknown individual or individuals. On March 7, 1975, Fred Rourke was arrested and charged with Sabrina's murder. His lawyers requested, and were granted, a change in venue due to the amount of attention the case received in the local media in St. Clair County. His October 1975 trial was therefore held in Quincy, Illinois, in Adams County. The prosecution's case against Rourke was almost entirely circumstantial. Witnesses testified that he appeared to have a pistol in his right hip pocket when he came to search the area around Forney Lake the day Sabrina's body was discovered, potentially the same pistol that Rourke would claim had somehow been lost or stolen when police asked to examine it the following day. Other witnesses testified to the fact that Rourke had purchased a .380 pistol in 1971, that Sabrina had been killed by bullets fired from that same type of firearm, and that Rourke was familiar with the area around Forney Lake because he had previously gone target shooting there. St. Clair County Sheriff's Department Sergeant Charles Earhart also testified that he had examined Sabrina's Plymouth Satellite, the same car Kurt Linton had seen her riding as a passenger in on the day she went missing, a short time after her body was found. The carpet in the trunk of the car had been damp, as though it had just been washed. A major witness for the prosecution was Donald Martindale, a 19-year-old former employee of the International House of Pancakes on West Main Street in Belleville. Martindale testified that on the morning of June 9, 1974, a seemingly intoxicated Fred Rourke had stumbled into the restaurant. Martindale said that he had been sitting in a booth with the Kukers, a married couple who operated the restaurant. Rourke came up to them, and the Kukers told Martindale to leave, so he moved 2 booths away. Martindale could still hear the conversation Rourke was having with his managers, and testified that he heard a sobbing Rourke say, "I didn't mean to kill her." When Mrs. Kuker asked him who he was talking about, he replied, "Sabrina. I didn't mean to make her pregnant." A short time later, Mrs. Kuker asked Martindale, "You heard something out there, didn't you?" When Martindale said that he had, Mrs. Kuker told him that there was nothing to what he had heard, and that she would talk to Rourke in the morning. Rourke, at that time, was passed out in the booth. Martindale did not immediately report what he had overheard, because he assumed Mrs. Kuker would be doing something about it. Several weeks later, he mentioned the conversation to a friend, who was the son of a Belleville police officer. The friend convinced him to go to the police with his account. Rourke's attorneys attacked Martindale's credibility and the details of his story. They called Mr. and Mrs. Kuker as witnesses, and they both denied that the conversation had taken place. They further claimed that they had not even been at the restaurant at the time Martindale described in his testimony, and that Martindale's employment at the restaurant had ended the day before he said he had heard the conversation. However, their testimony about why he was no longer employed there did not match up. Mrs. Kuker said that Martindale had been fired, whereas Mr. Kuker said that Martindale had quit and left on friendly terms. Martindale disputed their account of the timing of the end of his employment, saying it came after June 9th. During his testimony, Martindale acknowledged that he had been arrested by Rourke for a curfew violation and 2 traffic offenses in 1973. Martindale said on the stand that he did not resent Rourke for arresting him because he had just been doing his job. The defense, however, brought up the fact that Martindale had been arrested 6 times between the ages of 14 and 17, again for curfew and traffic violations. He had been arrested again 3 days before he said he overheard Rourke confessing in the restaurant by one of Rourke's former riding partners. Martindale had been given a polygraph prior to being called as a witness in court, and had passed it, but that information could not legally be shared with the jury. Martindale's assertion that Rourke brought up Sabrina being pregnant does tie in with other witness testimony. While Sabrina's autopsy showed that she had not been pregnant at the time of her death, Rourke had been fixated on the possibility of her being pregnant since the early days of the investigation into her murder. When Rourke was interviewed by the Sheriff's Department the day Sabrina's body was found, he was asked if he knew of anyone who had a motive to harm her. For some reason, Rourke took this to mean that the investigator thought Sabrina had been pregnant. The investigator noted in his report that he had made no such insinuation. Sabrina's friend, Jean Morrisow, and her mother had gone to see Lorraine Rourke after Sabrina's body was found. While they were at the Rourke home, the county coroner called, and Fred Rourke went into another room to speak with him on the phone. When he came back into the room, he announced to everyone, well, she wasn't pregnant, much to the shock of his wife and guests. Lorraine asked her husband why anyone would have thought Sabrina had been pregnant, at which point Jean pointed out that it could have been a potential motive for someone to want to kill her. Jean's mother found the look Fred Rourke gave Jean in response to this statement disturbing, and she quickly ended their visit. This was not Jean's first concerning visit to the Rourke household since Sabrina's initial disappearance. Fred Rourke had called her a few days after Sabrina went missing, asking her if she knew anything about his stepdaughter's whereabouts. She did not. She paid Lorraine Rourke a visit a few days later to talk about Sabrina. Lorraine took Jean into Sabrina's bedroom to show her the brand new clothes left in the closet, still with their tags attached. Lorraine showed them to Jean because she did not believe that anyone would just leave without taking the clothes with them. To open the closet, Lorraine had to move a rug that was blocking its door. After showing Jean the new clothes Sabrina had left behind, Lorraine tried to close the closet door. It was at this time that Jean noticed a large amount of blood on the carpet under the rug that had been blocking the door. When Jean asked about it, Lorraine claimed that it was from Fred hurting himself when he tried to see if Sabrina had taken anything with her. Jean did not immediately report the blood stain. When Sabrina's body was found months later, however, she realized its potential significance and went to the police. By the time they went to the house to investigate her account, however, the blood was gone. Rourke's trial lasted for 4 days. On October 17, 1975, after 2.5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Rourke not guilty. Chief Assistant St. Clair County State's Attorney Richard Aguirre told the press after the verdict was returned that he had known that there had only been an outside chance of him securing a conviction in the case because of the circumstantial nature of the evidence he presented. He also said that his office considered Sabrina's case closed because he was still convinced of Rourke's guilt. From a legal perspective, however, Rourke is considered not guilty. Sabrina's case remains unsolved, and no one has ever been brought to justice for her murder. Aguirre's personal competence aside, the case would have needed to remain open so that further investigation could hopefully produce definitive answers in the case. Fred Rourke never returned to the police force. He worked as a roofer while his case was pending, and eventually became a truck driver. He was killed in an accident in St. Louis in November of 1978, when his truck struck a pole after another car cut him off while he was driving. Lorraine Rourke had Fred buried next to Sabrina. Lorraine married her third husband 2 years later, in 1980. She passed away in March of 2008, 10 months after suffering from a stroke, at the age of 71. Sabrina's father, Cain, passed away in October of 2013. Her sister, Kimberly, despite her own interest in finding out the truth about Sabrina's murder, limited her own investigative efforts while their father was still alive so as not to upset him. It was too painful for him, she told the Belleville News-Democrat in 2018. His way to deal with it was to just not talk about it. Kimberly's increased and ongoing efforts have so far not conclusively closed Sabrina's case, but she has been able to solve one mystery that plagued her for more than 4 decades: the location of her sister's grave. The Cain side of Sabrina's family was not notified of the location where she was buried, and at least one local newspaper misidentified the cemetery. In 2018, 44 years after Sabrina's death, Kimberly finally learned where her sister was buried. She is now able to visit her sister in her final resting place and bring her flowers.